image. So last time we had started talking about the 18th century, and I did a little overview of the Enlightenment, and we looked at one painting, which we'll come back again in a minute. We'll look at it again. So I want to look at different effects of the Enlightenment on art, because there's quite a range. I want to look at portraiture, that's particularly from Britain. Remember this painting when we were looking at the 17th century? There was one painter who tried but couldn't really open a workshop or have a career in Flanders because Peter Paul Rubens dominated so much. You know, he had worked briefly with Rubens, and remember he went to England, and I mentioned that this painting like this, Van Dyck, this is Anthony Van Dyck, this painting he did of Charles I in England would set a pattern or style of the English portraiture. So that's what we're going to look at now, is the style of portraiture initiated by Van Dyck in the 17th century, but we're going to look at the results in the 18th century. And it's a new kind of portrait, and in Britain, this art affected by the Enlightenment all deals with, I talked about morality before, using art to comment on the social structure in some way. And this artist, Thomas Gainsborough, who most people have heard of, Gainsborough made quite a career as a portrait painter in London in the 18th century. And it's because he was very good at certain kinds of portraits that the British wanted. And this is very, very British. Now, when you first look at it, it's sort of an odd looking portrait. I mean, we don't usually see, you know, the couple way over on one side, and it seems like really out of balance, but it's not when you realize it's not just a portrait of them. It's a portrait of them on their land, and it's just as much a portrait of the land. This is very much about class and privilege and reaffirming the social structure as it was at the time. We see Robert Andrews and his wife, Frances Carter, and he's presented very much like the country squire that he is, the sort of lord of the manor. And it's really sort of expressing his relationship to the land. The British have a very different relationship to the land than Americans, for example. You know, when Americans own something, you know, it's mine, I can do whatever I want with it. But the British have always seen themselves as more proprietors or caretakers of the land. They feel they have a responsibility to it, to care for it well, and to pass it on. And that ability to care for it well is part of what validates their rights and privileges as landowners and, you know, lords of the manor. And so he wants to show himself as a good caretaker, and he's doing that not only in the way he's dressed, but also in the land itself. They wanted to be seen with their land. This is always very recognizable countryside. I mean, it really is a portrait of the land. Sometimes you can see the manor house in the background, but in this case, he's demonstrating his modern use of the land in terms of agricultural techniques. The crops that you see on the right are being grown in new techniques. He's using new equipment. He's using what's called a seed drill, which was new, and plant seeds in these nice even rows to take advantage of it and get more out of the land. So he's demonstrating he's good at what he does. And by showing himself this way, literally as one with his land in a sense, and a good caretaker, he sees that as really validating. So this is sort of socially validating. For him anyway. You know, every time he sees this, he goes, yeah, it's right that I'm in this position, that I have this land because of everything you see here. And also notice the attentive dog in the lower left-hand corner. And we've talked about dogs and, you know, unattentive dogs and what that means. And this is a very attentive dog. So even that speaks to his position and importance, you know, the rightness of his power. Gainsborough.
Peggy?
Yes.
I just, what strikes me about this is that there's also almost a rebuke to the sort of frivolous nobility of, like, that Fragonard that we talked about with the swing. And it's like, you know, there's that kind of let them eat cake feel from the French nobility, and these people take their responsibilities seriously, you know.
This is decidedly British.
Yeah.
Right, and we're going to see. Well, we already kind of saw him making fun of the French before, but the British really do make fun of the French. They really do have a very, very different culture, and as you said, the aristocracy is different. But we also saw frivolous British aristocracy. But you're right. He's specifically saying, "I'm not that." You know, this was very different from Hogarth's, like the marriage contract, where you saw the frivolous aristocracy.
Right.
He's not like that. Portraits like these, and these are what we're most used to when we think of Gainsborough, are very successful. And while it's not overt, it's still speaking of a relationship to nature and class, especially the one on the left, Lady Anne Hamilton. This is, again, her portrait with her land, and the sort of naturalness of her position in the land. But the one on the right is interesting because this is Mrs. Wilfred Brimsley Sheridan. She was a very well-known professional singer at the time, and she's married to Sheridan, the playwright. You may be familiar with, I remember reading some of his plays, The Rivals and School for Scandal. These are sort of classic 18th century plays, and they were part of a more Enlightenment circle. And so she is in the land, but not as a proprietor, but she's meant to look natural. It may not be obvious, but they're dressed very differently. Lady Anne Hamilton is dressed in slightly more formal, not the big stiff 18th century, but Mrs. Sheridan is actually dressed in a new kind of clothes that were being influenced by the classical world. In the 1740s, excavation began on the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum for the first time. And what that did was everybody became fascinated with the ancient Greco-Roman world. I mean, neoclassicism begins because of that. It influenced furniture design, women's hairstyles, it influenced clothing styles, and she is wearing a kind of very loose-fitting woman's garment that was influenced by the kind of Greek and Roman garments they saw in pictures on pots and things like that. So it's meant to show her as more natural. And the way Gainsborough's painting her, he's painting like her and her clothes exactly the way he's painting the leaves. They're all this sort of wispy brushstroke. You know, it's not very firm. It's sort of ephemeral. And that's his way of sort of linking her to nature. So this is the land not as property, but the land as nature. And so much of the Enlightenment deals with the idea of what is natural. Notice her hair is loose and blowing in the air. It's really a beautiful portrait, and Gainsborough made quite a career from being very good at that. In France, we see other kinds of moralizing paintings. This is another kind. This is also reaffirming the sort of rightness of society, but in terms of behavior. This is, again, good behavior being shown. The subject matter of the governess is one which is popular in the 19th century. This is a little early. You know, the 19th century literature is filled with stories about governesses, you know, Jane Eyre and all that. And we're going to look at some 19th century paintings. So this is early, but it's not dealing with the governess in the same way. Those 19th century works deal with the sort of vulnerability of the young woman, you know, away from home. But this painting isn't about that. This really doesn't deal personally with the governess. It deals with class behavior and everyone understanding your position and behaving appropriately. So we have the young lord here who's being chastised by the governess because he's left his toys out, you know, things scattered on the floor. And it's her job to reprimand him. And it's his job to listen to her. So he needs to learn certain behaviors. He needs to learn he has responsibilities. And when it's time to put away childish things and be a responsible person, and it's her responsibility to interact with him in a kind of benevolent authority. So she is in an awkward position, but he's showing them both doing their duties. These are really popular little paintings. So he's listening to her. He has his eyes lowered appropriately, taking responsibility. So everyone's doing what they should. I mean, he has to learn not only to grow up to be an aristocrat, but both of them are also demonstrating proper ways to interact with someone of a different class from you. He needs to learn how to interact with servants and servants of different classes. Governess was higher than most servants in the house. She wasn't really a servant per se. She also wasn't the member of the family per se. It was an awkward sort of level. And he needs to know that he has to listen to her and do what she says. So it's a small painting, 18 inches by 15, but Chardin, made a career of these. This is really in the tradition of the sort of Dutch genre paintings, which we saw before, that dealt with, communicating morals, but this has more to do with behavior and how to behave than the Dutch paintings did. So nonetheless, an interesting work. I love Chardin. We have a Chardin in the Nelson Gallery, but it's just a painting of a fish. It's not anything moral. But we really get into morality here. Another French artist, Greuze, again, made a career from these paintings, affirming sort of middle class or working class morality. At this time, there wasn't quite as clear a definition of the difference between a middle class and a working class. That clarity comes with industrialism. And this is the 18th century in France. Now, they were not experiencing much industrialism yet. The British were, but not the French. It hasn't really begun. So we have a less clear division between middle and working class, something I'll talk about in the 19th century. What we have here is literally a wedding taking place. And I put middle/working class morality because it's sort of on that line between both. We have the young girl who's come home with her beau to be married. He has a bag of coins he's giving to the father, the dowry. And what's interesting is this is not about a marriage contract. This is about a wedding, because you have a notary here observing as witness and documenting this is a legal marriage that we're seeing here. You have various members of the family reacting. The mother and the sisters are sad. They're going to lose her. But the important thing is, they have their arms intertwined. This is being presented as a natural marriage. This is a love match. They've come together because they want to be together, and in front of the family who's supporting them. We know that things are well because we have little signals down here. You have the hen with their little chicks, this little family that suggests, in the future there will be, fertility. There's a little bowl on the floor with water, so everyone's being taken care of. There's not a lot of mess. They may be poor, but things are in their places appropriately. Now, the meaning of this, it was really quite different in the 18th century. For one thing, it's demonstrating a class of people that traditionally were identified as really not having morals. If you were working class or poor, that was because you were an immoral person. That was because you weren't a good person. The idea of affirming that a working class person can act morally was a kind of a radical idea, a very Enlightenment idea, beginning to look at classes in different ways. Also, the fact that they are being married at home and not in a church, the Enlightenment was very much questioning the role of the church and the control of the church, that it had to be responsible for everything. And they're sort of bypassing that entirely. And I can't help but see this, in relation to the one we looked at last time, Hogarth's, from slightly earlier, but it really doesn't matter. They're both influenced by the Enlightenment. And here we have on the left that sort of artificial arranged marriage between the aristocracy and the middle class merchant, and it's nothing but immorality. We know that this whole story ends badly when they all someone gets murdered and commits suicide, and it's just a really bad match. That's the artificial marriage, versus the one on the right, which is the natural marriage. And it's interesting that it's the aristocrats who are doing it the wrong way, the immoral way, and they're the ones that traditionally always believed, well, they were rich because they were good people, and that the poor were poor because they were bad people. And in this case, we see the roles being reversed, and that's very much an Enlightenment message. one of the really interesting moralizing paintings of the century near the end is this very famous portrait by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. She was an important court painter to the court, and was a very successful portrait artist and made a lot of good money. And she was Marie Antoinette's favorite portrait painter. Marie Antoinette, this is 2 years before the French Revolution, by the way. In 2 years, it's all going to begin. And Marie Antoinette was considerably under pressure. She was being attacked, had been for quite a long time, even more so than the king. She was a foreigner. She was attacked as...
Hello?
Yeah, yes, you're here.
Hello?
She was attacked as being selfish, extravagant, and immoral. And increasingly, she was attacked as being a bad mother. One of the, another one of the fallouts, one of the things being questioned in the Enlightenment was, you know, well, how are families made? You know, we've already seen them discussing how should marriages be made? Should they be artificially arranged? Should it be natural? Now they're talking about how should children be raised? Should you, you know, give them away to somebody else to raise, you know, like a governess, and not see them until they're adults? Should we send them away to school? This is all being talked about. And so she was being criticized for being a bad mother. So she commissioned this painting very intentionally to counteract that argument, to be seen as a good mother. And it was almost an impossible task from the beginning, because on the one hand, she's the Queen of France, you know, she has to be shown in some sort of regal, formal manner, but she brings in the children. How do you think this was accepted? Do you think they bought it? Nah, not a chance. People made fun of this painting even at the time. It didn't convince anyone. No, clearly the young daughter over here is supposed to be showing some sort of intimate relationship. Really, it just looks like she's begging for attention and isn't getting any. She's not really holding this child very well. This is the young Dauphin. He was in line to be the next king, never quite got there, and he's showing the empty bed where the fourth child who died at birth would have been. So maybe that was for a little sympathy, I don't know, but none of it really worked. She's even using very intentionally this triangular pose here, the triangle, mimicking Raphael's paintings of the Madonna and Child. Can you see, you know, the connection here? You know, she wants to be seen like a Madonna and Child, but it didn't really work, and it didn't counter the scandal at all. But you know who did do it well? And I'm jumping 100 years ahead. You know, this is not the 19th century, but the one who did do that well was Victoria. Victoria figured out how to present herself, and she was a very smart woman and very much in control of her image, and she knew very well how to link the court with sort of family values. Of course, it was a different world. It was truly a love match for one thing, but she was the mother of the country, and there are thousands of images of Victoria with her thousands of children. I don't remember how many she had, but a whole lot. This is early, it's a young Victoria, only one child here, but this is what Marie Antoinette was hoping to communicate, this kind of casualness. Victoria is still formal, dressed regally, but yet we get a casual, intimate sort of family scene here. These were very popular with the nation, as was Victoria. But the 18th century didn't allow that. The 19th century did.
Peggy,
Yes.
are those dead birds on the ottoman?
Yes. Oh, yes. Hunting. They'd been hunting. He must have just gotten back from a hunting trip, and so just came in to see his beautiful family, and the baby's picking up a dead bird. This is just British. You know, if you watch much British television or film, you know these hunting parties. They just casually carry around dead birds, you know, and fling them down. I've seen that numerous times. But yeah, that's what they are. Okay. I sent out, uh, most of you probably got it, that summary of the major events of French political history. I know some of you might be interested. All of that doesn't matter, but a lot of that matters. So it's there in case you want to follow along, because it's going to influence art to a great extent. Leading up, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the French were dissatisfied throughout much of the 18th century. It's certainly the Enlightenment questioning is relevant, but so is the abuses of the monarchy. The monarchy was nearly bankrupt by the end of the 18th century, not only like funding things like the American Revolution, but funding things like the palace at Versailles, which took vast amounts of money. There were issues regarding over privileges. One of the most important privileges that the first two estates had, the first estate is the clergy, the second is the nobility, the third is the commoners, made up of middle and working class. But the first two estates, the clergy and the nobility, had one very, very important privilege, and that was that they didn't have to pay taxes. Only commoners paid taxes, which meant, which is kind of like now, only they don't admit it. But, it's kind of like that. The president paid $750 in taxes, but the French monarchy paid none. They get Versailles and they didn't pay a penny toward it. That's not popular. Anyway, it all breaks loose. Rumors are flying around Paris, and in 1789, they stormed the Bastille to get, they stormed the Bastille to get weapons that are stored there, because there's a rumor that the king is coming in with his troops, which wasn't true at all. But anyway, that starts the whole thing. Once it starts, we'll come back to what happens later. But as we're moving toward the revolution, there is a new style that becomes powerful. This painting actually was commissioned by the monarchy, not the king personally, but the person who was in charge of their arts. And in fact, it's a work in a new style, not that new, but a style called neoclassicism. Remember, I just said that the excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum, beginning in the 1740s, had drawn people's attention to the ancient world, and artists started reviving the classicism of the past, and particularly the idea of using stories from antiquity, particularly Roman history, as a way of speaking about morality. And the idea that anyone should hold ancient Rome up as a symbol of morality is laughable, but nonetheless, that's what they did, because that's what they wanted to believe about Rome. It's partially because they were so disturbed by the morality of their own culture. They were sort of idealizing the past. And the monarchy was being criticized for their immorality so much that they were beginning to embrace this style of neoclassicism. Let's talk about what this painting is, and then we'll talk about how it was seen by the revolutionaries, which is not the same way it was seen by the king. It's a story from ancient Rome, painted by Jacques-Louis David, and David was the most important painter at the time. He was someone personally involved in the revolution, and someone who continues to be important for the next 10 to 20 years. So we'll talk about David a bit more. The subject, Oath of the Horatii, is an ancient story. It comes from the ancient world, but it was also a contemporary popular play. The story was popular in France, and there was a play that was actually running in Paris at the same time he painted this painting. So everybody knew this story. It tells the story of a period right before the founding of the Roman Republic. So it goes back to like the 8th century BCE. This isn't about the Roman Empire. It's a story from very early. And there were two families, the Horatio family and the Alban family, and they had a dispute, border dispute. And rather than sort of fight a war over it, they decided that each family would send out 3 sons to fight to the death, and the last man standing would determine who won. and they're getting ready to go. That's the father in the middle, and he's holding up their swords, and the three sons are taking an oath. They're swearing an oath on their swords, and that's what the title refers to. And the oath they're taking is a common one in the ancient world. They're swearing to come home with their shield or on it, which actually goes back to the Greek world. Basically, it's win or die is the oath that you're taking. It's a very, very classical painting. Remember, we looked at Nicolas Poussin last time and the establishment of classicism as the French style. Well, David is reinstating that statement here. It's perfectly symmetrical and balanced as a classical painting should be. It's framed on either side with something in the back to stop your view, just like the classical landscapes we looked at. It's like a little stage set. Even the lighting looks like it's spotlights. And he's intentionally dividing it into two halves. On the left, you have the men, and on the right, you have the women. On the left was meant to be seen as the moral side, because the men know their responsibility, and they're taking a vow to go out and fight to the death, where the women on the right are being weak and not really very, very moral. And he meant that quite literally. The woman here, in the center is Sabina, and she is married to one of these three men, and these are her children back here with the nursemaid, but she's also the sister of the three men they're going to fight. The younger woman here, her name is Camilla, and she is the sister of these three. She's a Horatio, but she is engaged to one of the three men they're going to fight. So what these women know is that they're going to lose, that there's no winning this contest. They're either going to lose husbands, brothers, or fiancés. That's it. Nobody wins this battle. And they know that. And that's why they're weeping. And that's why they're seen as weak, because they don't understand the higher moral point being made here about absolute responsibility. Now, the rest of the story is, which others would have known at the time, is that they do go out and fight, that one of these three Horatio brothers is the last one standing. He comes back and he finds his sister weeping, and he gets so mad at her immorality that he kills her. He is put on trial for murder, and a jury of Roman citizens acquits him. Well, first of all, the father gives this impassioned speech at his trial, saying, defending his son, saying, he had no choice whatsoever. This girl did not understand anything about duty or morality, and he just had to kill her. And therefore, the son is acquitted, and they all go home, the end. Now, if that's not an appalling story, I don't know what is, but it speaks of the extreme self-righteousness at the time of the American Revolution. It's very much the view of the revolutionaries before the fighting actually begins, this sense that, yes, we're right. And it's what everyone feels like marching off to war who has no actual memory of what it's like. Because this is pre-revolution, and David will actually change his point of view once the fighting starts and the reign of terror starts. But at this point, there's a kind of absolutism in this painting that's communicated not only by the subject, but how he's telling this story. It's very linear. There's not a brushstroke visible anywhere. There's a hard edges and in the light, in all of the forms. Everything about it is harsh and very intense, and that really fits perfectly with the moment in time. Now, what the king saw was, and why he commissioned it, or his people commissioned it, is that it's about duty and loyalty. That's what they thought. Let's try and convince people to be loyal. But the revolutionaries after the revolution are going to take another aspect from the story. After this battle was fought, it led to the founding of the Roman Republic. And so the revolutionaries are going to tie this to the founding of a republic. and the overthrow of a monarchy. When the king didn't see that part of the story, may not have commissioned this if they really thought about the story fully, but the revolutionaries saw it, and they really understood the importance of this painting to be about setting a republic and overthrowing a monarchy. So that tells a very important story. It also was held up oppositional by many people to Rococo, and sort of the idea of high morality versus no morality. And when you look at Fragonard, you know, these signify two political points of view, two groups of people, two social contexts. You know, the one on the right, you know, painted for the aristocracy, is seen now as a demonstration of their lacks of morals, no strength, their weakness and lacks of morality, where now the neoclassical painting is held up as the symbol of highest morality, particularly by the revolutionaries, you know, and the idea of a republic. Neoclassicism also, you know, spreads, it becomes a popular style, also in Britain. This is a painting by Angelica Kaufmann, the only woman who worked in a neoclassical style. She's not really British. She was Swiss, and trained in Italy, but went to London and really made her career there. And she gives us an interesting take on morality from a woman's point of view, also tapping into that Roman context, although she does choose highly moral Romans. Cornelia pointing to her children as her treasures. Cornelia was the mother of the Gracchi family, and they are known in Roman history as one of the few kind of moral families in ancient, in the Roman Empire. And so it really is tapping into that. And her two sons there who grow up to be important reformers in Rome, and try to do good things. So she's picked a good Roman family. And what's happening is Cornelia is visiting a friend, and her friend is showing all her jewelry, and Cornelia gestures to her children and says, you know, these are my treasures. So we've got another look at the, you know, the theme of the good mother again, in this case Cornelius being a good mother, and it's sort of the female equivalent to David's sort of masculine male definition of morality, versus the sort of female view of morality, but it's still using that classical language. You know, that's neoclassicism, or the new classicism of the 18th and early 19th century, is basically classical, somewhat in composition and in paint handling, but mostly in its reference to the ancient world, primarily Rome, as a language for speaking about contemporary issues. It may be using the world of Rome, but they're not speaking about ancient Rome. They're speaking about their world right now. I'm saying something about what's happening right now through the language of Rome. And you can get away with saying things that way that you might not be able to say if you use, you know, the actual language, contemporary language of the world that you lived in. So this neoclassicism, when the revolution happens, automatically becomes the dominant form of art. In fact, Jacques-Louis David, after the revolution, will be made the head of the arts in France, and he will reestablish classicism as the required style in the French Academy. Remember, Rococo slipped in there? You know, early in the 18th century, Rococo slipped into the Academy and became accepted, that fête galante was okay, but David is going to, it's over, you know, no more. In fact, Rococo painters like Fragonard literally had to get out of the country. Their lives were in jeopardy. They were so connected to the aristocracy that as an artist, he had to leave or he would have been in jeopardy. Let's talk about the 19th century. You know, a nice list like I gave you of all these political events is great, but I can only understand things if I see them in a diagram. You know, lists of dates and events mean nothing to me. I'm a visual person, and this is the same thing that's on that sheet of paper, but it's visual. And this whole thing is the 19th century. And all these little red bars mark revolutionary changes. This is a century of revolution. It may have begun in 1789, but it continues throughout the whole 19th century. And all of the art is related to these different moments in time. You know, it's chaos after the revolution, the reign of terror, executions run by the Jacobin Party who were in charge. They eventually start turning on their political rivals and executing them. Then they turn on each other. And that the reign of terror doesn't end until all the Jacobins are dead, except for one. Jacques-Louis David, the artist, is the only Jacobin that lived through the revolution. And that was partially because he was very, very famous, and very famous people are treated differently. He was a star in the art world. But when the Reign of Terror ends, they established a government called the Directory, which was so corrupt, they couldn't take it anymore. You know, during all of this period of revolution, France is fighting foreign wars. You know, when the revolution started by 92, the king and queen were executed in 92. All of the countries surrounding France have monarchs, and they're getting really worried. They're getting nervous. You know, if the French monarchy is overthrown, what is that going to mean? And so they try to attack Paris. They try to break free. In 92, the Austro-Hungarians tried to conquer Paris because they were going to put the king and queen back on the throne. And they were repelled by the French. And so the French are fighting a foreign war. At the same time, they're having an internal revolution. They're fighting particularly the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the British as well. And there was a general working his way up through the ranks during this period, and his name was Napoleon Bonaparte. And he'd worked his way all the way up to the top. And in 1799, he said, that's enough. He goes back to Paris, and it's not a revolution, it's a coup. He just comes in and says, I'm taking over. You guys are so corrupt and incompetent. And he sets up a government called a consulate, which is based on the style of the Roman Republic, where there were 3 consuls, and he was one of the 3. And he does that for 4 years, and then he says, oh, the heck with it. This is really an empire. And in 1804, he declares an empire. And this is the Napoleonic Empire, which lasts until, well, 1814 and again in 1815 briefly. And he's now conquering much of Europe before he's finally defeated. This opens the door to Romanticism. And we'll talk about why the presence of Napoleon makes Romantic art possible in France. When Napoleon is defeated and expelled, what happens? The Restoration. The Bourbon monarchy is restored. Not only do they have monarchy again, they have the same dynasty. It's more Bourbons on the throne. And you get 2 French kings here through the Restoration, although they're really quite weak. But this is a great period for Romanticism as well. This is the most interesting moment in the century, the 1830 Revolution. And Louis Philippe was the most savvy of all of the French rulers of the century. He was a cousin of the Bourbon monarchs, but he also knew that to be successful, you had to be a politician, and that you couldn't just say, I'm king by divine right. That doesn't work anymore. You had to have the support of the people. He's also the first to recognize the growing power of the middle class, because we're now in deep into the Industrial Revolution, which meant there was a growing middle class. And I want to clarify the definition here because it begins to matter. When industrialism begins, it divides the commoners into middle class and working class. The middle class is equivalent to what we would call the capitalists. These are the owners of the factories, the owners of the mills, the owners of the mines. It's a newly enfranchised, growing, somewhat wealthy. That's the middle class. And they are, by this time, they are the most powerful class in France. The working class are the people who work in the factories and work in the mills and work in the mines. And that's very different from the middle class owners, the bourgeoisie. It's different. And Louis Philippe understood the power of the middle class, and he directly reached out to them. He purposely said what they wanted to hear. And this was a middle class revolution strictly for the purpose of putting Louis Philippe on the throne. And so we trade the Bourbon monarchs, kings, for this period called the July monarchy. This was the July Revolution, a revolution in July, so they call it the July Revolution, and it led to the reign of Louis Philippe, which also was very favorable to the Romantics. Romanticism dominates the first half of the century. All of this period is favorable because it's very much a middle class art, as we will see. Mid-century, it changes dramatically because, you know, who's suffering during all this period? The working class. And in 48, we get the first ever working class revolution for the purpose of setting up a socialist government. We'll be talking more about socialism, but from the 30s on, there's a lot of socialist theory being written. A lot of writers in France are talking about socialism. In fact, from the very beginning of capitalism, there was socialism as an oppositional voice. They went hand in hand from the beginning. And we get a working class revolution here attempting to set up a socialist government in Paris, bypassing republic altogether. It didn't work. They couldn't set up a socialist government, but in compromise, they got rid of the monarchy and set up a true republic, briefly. Meaning, for the first time, the French elected a president in 1848. Sounds good, but as we all know, it depends who you elect. And they elected Louis Napoleon, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. And Louis Napoleon, in a free society for 4 years, rules as president, but when it's time for his second term, he says, screw it, and declares an empire just like his uncle did back then. And we have the beginning of what is known as the Second Empire. And the Second Empire is the empire of Napoleon III. Don't ask me what happened to Napoleon II. I don't know. We go from Napoleon to Napoleon III. Somewhere in there was a Napoleon II, but he didn't rule anything, so I don't know anything about him. Now, what's important about these 4 years, these are the most important 4 years in French history, because during these 4 years, number one, the working class were enfranchised. They got the vote. The working class voted. Well, everybody voted for the first time, but the working class got to vote. That was rescinded after 4 years. Also, during those 4 years, the French Salon, remember the Salon, that annual exhibition that was juried by those old men at the academy who controlled who got in? There were 4 years of what were called free salons. What that meant was anything could be shown. And a whole lot of art was shown here that would never have been accepted by the salon. And the problem with freedom is you could try and take it away, but you can never close that door again. People had freedoms that they were not going to let go. And well, that really affects the art world, because there's a whole new kind of art made during that period, and it's never going to stop. This long period of the Second Empire is very important for the arts. We'll talk about that. It really opened a lot of doors, and Paris changes dramatically. That ends, interestingly, in 1870, because France is fighting the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and Louis Napoleon goes out to the battlefield and gets himself captured, like within 2 months of the beginning of that war. And so like it's over really quickly. That's when they establish another republic, a true republic this time that lasts. But this is chaotic. You've got all these different governments that were favorable in different ways to different kinds of art, that favored different classes in France and therefore different subjects. So let's talk about the 19th century. Period of war, we know that. We just talked about that. Also the period of the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution was doing important things. It was shifting power from the aristocracy to this industrial capitalist in the middle class. So this basically is the rising of the middle class. Dissatisfaction, from the very beginning of the modern world, people have had an ambivalent relationship to that world. We love it, we hate it. Industrialism, we love it, we hate it. Yeah, I can buy all these things now that are made cheaply, but at the same time you have, no protections, people were worked, 18-hour days, you had child labor, it was an abusive system. So yeah, they're good and bad. And then by mid-century, the socialist position, that's when they have the socialist revolution. The main thing that's going to do is draw attention back to the real world. This is when it becomes irresponsible to be a romantic. Because you're escaping and you're ignoring the realities of the real world. So we'll follow that. As I said, the first half dominated by romanticism. At mid-century, realism comes in, and we're going to see for a lot of the second half, realism is going to dominate, and we'll talk about the rise of an avant-garde. And then by the end of the 19th century, we have competing avant-gardes. We have people arguing, no, this is what it means to be avant-garde. No, that is what it means. So they're not fighting the aristocracy anymore. They're fighting each other over what art should be. This is a big issue. With the end of an aristocracy, artists were put in the position of having to decide what art should be. When someone comes to you and commissions you and tells you what to paint, you don't have to think about it. They just told you what to paint. But if that's not the way art works anymore, you have to decide. It's sort of like the Dutch Netherlands in the 17th century, where artists were painting works of art, without commissions. Now that's pretty much what most people are doing. So let's talk about Romanticism and what that is. Romanticism isn't really a style. In fact, this is a good point. Before I start it, let's take a break. Let's take our 5-minute break right now because it's 2 o'clock, and then we'll come back and define Romanticism. We'll start looking at some. So see you in a few minutes.
You ever feel like you're riding in a race car at about 110 miles per hour through art and history and all sorts of other interconnected subjects?
Not me. I look out the window and I enjoy whatever snapshot happens.
It's a heck of a ride, and I'm really enjoying it.
Well, I feel like it. I feel like I'm running the racetrack.
Well,
I know I talk really fast. I've been told that my entire life by students. When I'm talking about this, I get caught up in it. And so if I'm talking too fast, just remind me to slow down. My students always had to do that, tell me to slow down, because they were trying to take notes on everything. And I know how hard that is, trying to get everything down when I'm talking fast. So
I do the same thing, Peggy. That's what I told my students last night.
yeah.
I tend to speak really quickly. So if you don't grasp something, just let me know, because I forget what that I may be going too fast.
Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I'm just not really aware I'm doing it until I stop to think about it. I'm not realizing how fast it is I'm going, because my mind is sort of up on the next thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, whatever it is, I think it works pretty good.
Good, as long as.
There's a lot to get in, and you're only scraping the surface. I'm sure you could do 20 more stories.
It's true, yeah, and that's why it was so hard putting this together. This is really not the same class I would teach to other students, because you're not the same as students. You're not 18-year-olds, so I know, plus, I know the kinds of things you all might be interested in may not be the same things that my other students would have been interested in. So I'm trying to bring in some aspects that maybe I wouldn't only go into in the more advanced class, but I'll bring them down into this class. So anyway, yeah, putting this together is not easy. And I'm also teaching a class at Johnson County Community College, which actually starts next week. That's just on medieval art. And so I can't really do the medieval section I did with you all because I don't have exactly the same time frame that I had with you all. So I'm pulling things out and putting things in. And plus there's going to be like a couple of weeks where I'm teaching both. So on one day I'm in the Middle Ages, on another day, you know, I'm up to the 19th century again. But that's not uncommon. You know, when I taught full time, you know, in one day I might jump from the Roman Empire up to the Middle Ages and then over to China. I mean, just in one day, your mind is jumping all over. I just haven't done it for a few years, so I'm not used to it.
Well, hang on and enjoy the ride.
Yeah.
You're doing a great job, Peggy.
Oh, well, thank you. But my mind isn't what it used to be. But actually,
Neither is mine.
doing this class is helping me. It's getting my mind sharper again and
Sure.
bringing things back that I don't want to forget. I mean, you don't want to forget things that you've learned. That's horrible. So it's refreshing my mind again, which is really good for me.
Have you ever gone into one class and then talked about a totally different subject or the subject of the prior class?
No, but one of the worst things I have to do is teaching two sections of the same class. I used to try and avoid that like crazy. Like if I had literally two sections of the same class, and at 10 o'clock I would do a class, and then like at 12:30 I would have to do that exact same class again, which is really, really hard because it's impossible to keep two sections together because you never say exactly the same thing, and they'll ask questions in one that don't get asked in the other. And plus you live in a constant state of deja vu.
Yeah.
Like, did I just say that or did I not say that? And then after a few years, it's like something you said 3 months ago feels like you just said it. And just trying to, keep track of it all is a nightmare. No, I've never done the wrong class, but I was always careful when I set up my schedule that if I'm doing I always did two classes. I had two Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes and then two Tuesday, Thursday classes. So on any given day, I only had two classes. But I made sure whatever they were in chronological order. Maybe one is an ancient and one is an advanced class in the 19th century. I would have to do the ancient one first and then the 19th century. I couldn't do it the other way around. I couldn't like chronologically go backwards in the same day. That helped, at least that way. And I demanded at least an hour and a half in between each class so that I could sit down and get my mind out of one context and back around another one. It takes time to get your head organized. Okay, that's long enough. Let's move on. Okay. Romanticism is not an easy thing to define. It's not like a clear style where I can say, well, it's because they use this composition or this kind of paint. It is more to do with a sensibility in art. To romanticize something, first of all, is going to be very personal. It's always a personal expression, and it tends to be emotional in some ways. It might be to exoticize something. We're going to see that they're going to become fascinated with exotic, and we'll see what that means. It often elevates something, elevates some aspect of something in a very personal way over other things. It's not the same as idealizing. My students had a hard time keeping those two straight. To idealize is to express something the way you want it to be or the way you think it should be. Romanticism isn't necessarily like that at all. In fact, the Romantics loved sort of violent scenes and gory scenes can be very romantic. That certainly isn't ideal. You know, you don't want that to be. So it's going to be different. So let's just look at some examples and we'll see. Francisco Goya in Spain was one of the earliest artists to begin expressing this sensibility. Romanticism actually begins in Germany in literature. It begins with the German Sturm und Drang writers. Storm and stress is what it means, but it's a kind of an emotional, passionate writing style in the 18th century. And then it goes to England and then Spain, and France is actually the last place to finally accept Romanticism. Goya was part of a kind of Enlightenment circle in the late 18th century in Spain. Spain was very closely aligned with France. The Spanish king at this point was, you know, related to the French monarch. So they're experiencing very similar things. And I love this. This is actually the frontispiece. It's an engraving. No, it's not. It's an etching to his Los Caprichos. Oops, lost my cursor again. Usually, there it is. I can always find it if I change the slide, it pops back up. Los Caprichos is simply a book of etchings that he did that show the sort of capriciousness, sort of mocking the pretensions of the Spanish aristocracy. So that's what the book was. But this frontispiece is really interesting, and it's very much an Enlightenment statement. You know, the sleep of reason produces monsters, and that's actually what it says right there. And it's really sort of an ultimate expression of the importance of the rational. You know, if you aren't rational, if you for a minute stop, you know, using your enlightened mind, then all sorts of horrible things can happen. And what I love about this is about 100 years before Sigmund Freud is going to propose this concept of a subconscious mind, and yet he's suggesting, you know, that when you sleep, or when the conscious rational mind is asleep, the sort of unconscious irrational demons appear. It's a fascinating way of visualizing a concept that won't exist for another 100 years. It's also very, very influential on a group of artists that I did all my work on as a scholar, and that's the Surrealists in the early 20th century, are very influenced by Goya and this image and some of these early ideas. Because Goya saw it all. You know, Goya saw some of the most horrible things you could imagine during the Napoleonic War. The French invaded Spain. Napoleon's troops had invaded Spain, and he put, I think, one of his brothers on the throne there at the time, and it led to terrible atrocities. Between 1808 and 1814, the French troops were in Spain, and the Spanish fought them like no one else in Europe. And there were terrible atrocities on both sides, and it kept going back and forth, getting worse and worse. And Goya did a huge series of 82 etchings called The Disasters of War. They're his most famous works. And this is one of them. And this is very mild. Many of them are horrible, like bodies, parts of bodies hanging from trees. And these are not things he made up. These are all things that he witnessed. And they're absolutely horrible images of war. And it really changed Goya from this sort of optimistic, enlightened man who believes that man is rational. You know, how can you believe man is a rational being when you witness the things that he witnessed? It's like someone living through the Holocaust who knows what human beings are really like and really able to do. And his work gets really dark in later years. Wait a minute. Okay. Wait a minute. There's a painting. There it is. This is what I was trying to get to. I got them out of order. Okay. Goya's most famous painting from this period is this one, the 3rd of May, 1808. And it's a very good example of how you romanticize. So that'll be easier to describe in the context of this painting. Title is the 3rd of May, 1808. The 2nd of May, 1808 was the day the French troops arrived in Madrid. And that night, they were attacked and massacred. A bunch of French soldiers were massacred. And so the French decided to teach the Spanish a lesson. So the next day, the 3rd of May, they chose 100 random citizens of Madrid and marched them out of the city and executed them. And that's what you're seeing here. Now, this is a very personal statement on Goya's part. This is not realism. This is not some sort of neutral journalist telling you the story. This is very biased. It's very clear who he's identifying as the heroic figures. It's very clear who are the evil monsters, presented almost like a machine. You have this guy with his white shirt and this lantern that shines on it in this almost Christ-like pose, like Christ on the cross, presented in a strangely heroic way. People commented about this paint, this red paint that was like blood, and it's very thick and sort of gory. And then over here you get this faceless like machine, you know, they're all in uniform. He doesn't want you to see any of their faces so you don't humanize them, you know, they're completely dehumanized. But he's trying to, in a sense, do something that becomes much more common in the modern world, and pay attention to this because we do it all the time, and that is to heroize the victim, to take someone who's a victim and call them a hero. It sometimes drives me crazy. You know, we did it all the time after 9/11. People who were killed in the building were talked about as heroes, when in fact they were innocent victims. The traditional definition of hero was self-sacrifice, right? And intentional putting yourself at risk. But these were not the insurrectionists. These were not the rebels who actually took that risk and attacked the French soldiers. These are just random people from the city. So they're not heroic. They're victims. They're absolutely victims. But this tendency to heroize victims is a modern concept. You don't see it before the 19th century. You see it a lot after the 19th century. But he needs to do that because he's trying to make a point. You know, he wants you to see who are the good guys, who are the evil bad guys. And we even get the church on the horizon because the Spanish always referred to the godless French. That's how they saw the French. And I mean, the French were Catholic, just like the Spanish were, but they weren't as Catholic. You know, they didn't have that Spanish intensity, you know, that went back to the expulsion of the Muslims, you know, in the 15th century. So they called them godless. The church is there to remind you of that. In terms of style, the Romantic painters aren't doing anything new stylistically in terms of composition, in terms of paint, nothing. They primarily borrow from the Baroque. I mean, if you want an emotional painting, nobody did it better than the Baroque painters. So, you know, you get the dark background. Spanish paintings were like that 200 years earlier. Or 100 years earlier. So they're relying on the Baroque style. Now, we just saw one side of the Napoleonic War. We're going to look at the other side in just a moment, but I want to say something about Napoleon himself, because this man's personal taste affects the direction of art. You know, he's the emperor from like 1804 to 1814, and during that period, he has, you know, a lot of art commissioned. David, who managed to live through the Reign of Terror, and even after that was over, he managed to live through it. When Napoleon came into power, he switched his allegiance and swore allegiance to Napoleon. He was very good at switching back and forth. So he became a painter for Napoleon, although Napoleon never really cared for his art that much. Napoleon preferred not the neoclassical style of David, but the more romantic style of a young artist that he had met years earlier named Gros. And we're going to look at a painting by Gros in a moment. This is actually from about 1797, before Napoleon took power, when he was just a general. Gros was actually from an aristocratic family, and he was a student of David's. He worked in his studio. When the revolution began, anyone from an aristocratic family was in jeopardy. Well, David actually helped him escape from the country. He used his position as a member of the Jacobin Party to help Gros get to Italy, which saved his life, very likely. So while Gros was in Italy during all this period, the Reign of Terror and the Directory, he met this woman. First, he met actually Josephine, Napoleon's wife, and then through her he met Napoleon, who was a general, and he was actually doing paintings for Napoleon before Napoleon went back and even took power. But it's a very different style. Gros studied with David and tried to do neoclassical art, but it wasn't his taste, his sensibility. And once he got away from Paris, he started working in a much more romantic way. This is a very romanticized view of Napoleon. You see it in the, the wind is blowing his hair, he's creating this wonderful mood, where the neoclassical version, it wouldn't even know it was the same person. Granted, this is quite a few years later. David's was done many years later. Napoleon is older, but nonetheless, it's very formal and very stiff. The monarchy might have liked this kind of formal painting, but Napoleon preferred something more emotional. Napoleon ruled not by divine right, but by the will of the people. He worked his way up through the ranks in the military, starting at the bottom. He led through personal charisma. The people loved him. It was an emotional connection to the people that defined his power, and he preferred an art form that communicated directly with the people in an emotional way, not an off-putting style like neoclassicism, which is sort of above it all. He preferred this style. It matched his sensibility and his method of rule more, and so he's always going to give more commissions to the Romantics. And this is, we saw Goya's view from Spain of the Napoleonic Wars, but here's a view by a French artist who's working for Napoleon, which gives you a very different view. Now, this is a very big painting, 17, well, that's backwards. Yeah, I'm using the wrong PowerPoint presentation. I should have reversed that. Obviously, it's 10 feet tall and 17 wide. These numbers should be reversed. Nonetheless, it's a really big painting. Napoleon in the Plague House at Jaffa. This is also a romanticized view of an event, but the event didn't really happen quite like this. The Plague House, a plague broke out in Jaffa in the Middle East when Napoleon and his troops were there, and they used this. This is actually a mosque. We're looking from inside the mosque out into the courtyard. You see the minaret here. It was taken over to use as a makeshift sort of hospital. The French learned this very early on, that when you get a plague or an illness like this, you need to isolate the people who are sick. The British didn't learn that for a very long time, but the French were doing that even at this very early date, and they isolated the people. And it shows Napoleon coming to visit his troops. And touching them. We'll look at that detail in a minute. This is very influenced by Baroque art. It's sort of asymmetrical, painterly style, a lot of emotion everywhere, a lot of movement everywhere. But this is the little scene I want to look at. Napoleon with his troops. Now, this was the bubonic plague, and one of the signs of the bubonic plague are what are called buboes. It's called that, which are these sort of black nodules that you get, under your arms, and he's literally reaching out to touch that. It was commonly believed that diseases like this could spread or be worsened through fear. So he's trying to alleviate fear by showing his bravery. There's also a sort of religious element with the laying on of hands. He's not averse to linking himself subtly with Christ-like gestures. And this nude figure here, this is one of the first times where nudity has been used to suggest vulnerability, which is also a phenomenon we see in the modern world. This is not the traditional nude hero. You know, it's not a symbol of heroism the way we've seen it for so long. It's a vulnerability and exposure, and that's really the very much the modern sense. Now, the other part of the story is this never happened. Napoleon never visited people with bubonic plague. In fact, he ordered them to be abandoned. He abandoned all of his men who had the plague and left. But that's not the point. The point is this is political propaganda. This is a romanticized view. It's a point of view. It's manipulated to express a particular point of view and to elevate it. The other thing that I want to say about this before I leave it, I don't have the term there, I have it here. This is an example of Orientalism, and we're going to see that again. Orientalism was a growing fascination with Turkish and Arab culture in the West, in France and in England. They were having some of their first exposure. France, in Algeria and North Africa, and travels in the Middle East. But the French and the English in particular become absolutely obsessed with Turkish and Arab culture. It's called Orientalism because they refer to that part of the world as the Orient, or anything, they really meant anything Islamic, and it exoticizes it. That's the exotic element of what you see here, is where it's taking place. So absolutely important. A little later, we yes.
One of those figures has 32 on the top of their head dress. Would you have any idea
what? Where?
So right behind the guy that Napoleon is touching?
Yeah. Oh, on his head.
Yeah. 32.
No, I do not.
Isn't that strange that it would be so clear in the only numeral? Okay. All right. Thanks. Sorry.
Oh, that's really interesting. No, I don't. I can't remember anybody talking about that either.
You're giving Peggy homework.
Yeah, now I gotta go find out. That's not gonna be easy to find out.
No, it isn't.
You're not gonna find that on the internet. You're gonna have to find, do some research, find some articles, and then go actually read them. And I'm not sure I want to do that.
It's all right. It was just a curiosity.
No, good, very good observation. Always ask, because sometimes I know those things, sometimes I don't. That I don't. Romanticism did finally enter France, kicking and screaming, because the French are going to cling to their classical style until you force them to do something else. Interestingly, as the middle class gained more and more power, it became clearer that Romanticism needed to be accepted by the Academy. They wouldn't accept it for a long time, but it eventually was accepted, particularly by 1830. As soon as Louis Philippe is in power, and it's the middle class that put him there. The Academy had to acknowledge the power of the middle class and started letting in, accepting romantic art into the Academy. And the most famous of all of the French romanticists is Delacroix, Eugène Delacroix. And I just wanted to show you this self-portrait because it's such a romantic self-portrait. I mean, I can't find a better example of a romantic self-portrait. There's something very, it's emotional, it's passionate, and it has its own sort of exoticism in it. But mostly I want to look at this large painting by Delacroix because it is, again, a classic example of Romanticism. I just want to show you the scale here. Some of the biggest paintings ever made are from this period. I mean, the Romantics make some gigantic art. So this is 16 foot across. Another example of Orientalism. This is perfect romantic in every way, in terms of the dynamic composition, the rich colors, the subject is exotic, escapist. Sardanapalus it's a story, again, from antiquity. I don't remember exactly where he was from, some Assyrian leader or someone in the Middle East, and he's being overrun, his soldiers are being killed, and He's in a tent here, and before they come in and capture him, he orders that all of his servants, the women in his harem, like everyone be massacred and killed in front of him before he dies. And he's just calmly laying there watching this massacre going on all around him. And it's exactly, it's very 19th century overall. They loved violence, and if you could do sex and violence together, that was even better. And if you could do it in an exotic place, that was even better. So it puts everything together here. You kind of have to look at the details to get a sense of the colors, the rich colors. Now, at first glance, it's actually very similar to like the style of a Rubens or something in terms of the rich colors and the layering, but he's actually doing some much more modern use of color in terms of dividing colors into their original elements, like putting two colors side by side rather than mixing them. I mean, he's really one of the first artists to begin to do that. We call it divisionism, dividing colors. It's not till later that becomes important, but later painters in the 70s, like the Impressionists, for example, are going to look directly back to Delacroix as an inspiration for use of color. And it really is an astounding sense of color. So Delacroix is sort of archetypal as a romantic painter, but is not the only type of painter. There is a small Delacroix in the Nelson Gallery. This is in the Nelson Gallery. It's one of about 3 different small paintings he did of this scene, Christ on the Sea of Galilee. Ships in a storm on the sea is probably one of the most popular subjects of the entire 19th century. There are thousands of paintings of ships on the sea in storms because it was simply happening a lot. You know, the merchant fleets were out everywhere around the world at this time. One of the things you can see in this painting is that Delacroix has no interest whatever in classical accuracy or proportion. You know, it doesn't matter that this doesn't look right or he's not concerned with that at all. And that's really a violation of sort of academic standards. You know, it's not just the classical style they wanted in the academy. They expected, you know, accuracy and clarity. Painters traditionally for the whole 18th century and much of the 19th in the academy, they were all traveling to Rome to study ruins. You know, you want to be a good classicist, you go to Rome. In fact, the French Academy had an annex there. There's the French Academy in Rome. There's a school there. And if you won a big prize in Paris at the Salon, you could get like 6 years free at the French Academy. You could go down there, they pay you for 6 years and, you know, all your expenses, and you could study all that classicism. And that's what every artist wanted to do until the Romantics came along, or even some of the early Romantics did it. But Delacroix couldn't have cared less about going to Rome. He didn't want to go to Rome. So where did he go? He went to Algeria in North Africa, and he studied the exotic scenes and colors and textiles and everything that he could see there. That's what he wanted to see, because Delacroix is of that first generation for whom neoclassicism was on the way out when he was born. You know, there was never a point where he was trained in neoclassical art. It's not that he had to learn that and make a switch like Gros did. You know, Gros was trained in neoclassical and transitioned into romanticism. Delacroix, it never existed to him. And by 1820, neoclassical art looked terribly old-fashioned. And by 1820, first of all, when Napoleon fell out of power, David left. You know, he's not going to switch his allegiance one more time. It was one time too many he had switched allegiances. So he just left Paris. And it didn't matter because he was so popular. He went to Belgium and painted for the court there, but he was invited to all of the courts all over Europe. He could have gone anywhere. So he just left. So after 1820, at the very latest, neoclassicism was passé. It was just deadly old-fashioned. So, you know, Delacroix of that generation, he couldn't care less what was happening in Rome. And you see that certainly in paintings like this. This is what you get from spending time in Algeria, not from spending time in Rome. while I would say almost all romantic painters painted in a painterly style like this. This is a good example of a painterly style. You can see the brush strokes, they're big marks. You know, it's a very textured surface. It's very sensual in the sense that it's very tactile. You want to reach out and touch, you know, with your fingers, you could feel all this paint. There was one painter who sort of confused pretty much everybody. And his name was Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And Ingres was also a student of David. In fact, he was studying with him when Gros was studying with him. The difference is he never stopped. Ingres never stopped painting in this linear style. In most people's minds at this time, Romanticism and painterly art were the same thing. They didn't understand the idea of a linear romantic. How do you be a romantic and paint with this little style? So, and it was not only then that it confused people, it still confuses people. Many art historians have a hard time knowing where to put Ingres or how to teach him. Now, I'll show you why. Because of a painting like that, this is unique in the century and unique in romantic art. It's a totally romantic subject. You know, it's an odalisque. An odalisque is a woman in a harem. This is Orientalism 100%. This is the exotic sexuality that the French were obsessed with. Even the fact that she's a very pale-skinned European woman in a turban in a harem, whoa, they love that. I mean, that was just the essence of sort of erotic imagery. But it's all painted in a very fine linear brushwork. There's no brushwork visible. It's a slick, smooth surface. How do you deal with that? The Academy was in chaos. This is actually 814. This is the year Napoleon is overthrown. This is the year David leaves. He'd been the head of the Academy forever. The Academy had no leaders. There wasn't anybody out there to lead the Academy. And then they saw Ingres and they said, well, maybe you should lead the Academy, because he was a brilliant painter. But at the same time, they knew, they called it his unfortunate romantic tendencies is what they called it. He was a great painter, but he had these unfortunate romantic tendencies, but they could live with it if they had to. That's sort of the relationship with Ingres. And today, you will find books that talk about him in the context of the Academy, but not within the context of Romanticism. I personally have no problem seeing him as a romantic at all. To me, he's 100% romantic. But he was also the head of the Academy, which completely rejected Romanticism at this point in time. One of the things he was criticized for was, look at this elongated body. Someone actually counted the vertebrae, and she has too many. And this was at the time, and there was this big article that he couldn't paint the body because he gave her too many vertebrae. You know what he's influenced by here? Does this remind you of anything at all we've looked at? Any art where you saw figures like this that were, remember mannerism? Where we saw, like the Madonna with the long neck, where she had this odd body and very thin and these huge hips and everything was distorted. Well,
Lucas Chronic, his females, totally disproportionate.
right. For An, when he was a student, when you're a young student, you're given a studio space. Artists learn their craft in two ways. The Academy itself helped you with the school, and you would have a studio space, and then you also had to get yourself associated, get into the shop of a working painter. So you learned hand in hand by working with another painter. So he was working with David, but he also had his own shop, and those tended to be, his own studio space. And they were given space, usually in public buildings, like a lot of them had studio spaces in the Louvre or in sort of old government buildings. Well, Ingres was given a studio space when he was younger in what had been an old church that was converted into art studio spaces. And his studio space was filled with old engravings and sculptures that had Mannerist art in it. His studio was filled with Mannerist works of art, and it filtered in that sort of exaggeration of the forms is sort of where he picked up all those Mannerist details. It was also criticized because of the colors. Painters were trained to make paintings predominantly warm colors and then have cool colors to balance it, where this painting is predominantly cool. It's all these cool blues, which makes her seen that way. The way she's looking, it's like this cool, detached woman. You know, it adds to the sort of erotic nature of the scene. It's very sensual. You've got the textures, right? The satin and the feathers and the fur and the silk and the metal. And this is a kind of linen. And then you've got the texture of the flesh. It's this subtle study in color and texture everywhere. Ingres and Delacroix, their whole lives were set up against one another. People were constantly comparing the two of them in their style of art throughout their whole lives. Even in the great major exhibitions, you know, Delacroix would be given one big room, but then Ingres down the hall would get his own big room. I mean, it was like that forever. Not that they individually felt antagonistic to one another, they didn't, but people saw them that way. You know, of course we know where this comes from. This is very much in that tradition that goes back to Venice. When we looked at Titian and sort of the beginning of the reclining female nude, this is just a variation of it. Obviously, they both mean completely different things, but that's the root of that sort of sensual Venetian tradition. And Titian's was about textures and surfaces as well. So a really stunning painting and a really interesting person. There were even cartoons about them at the time. They talked about it as sort of the battle between color and line. What they meant was painterly versus linear. And so you've got Delacroix here with a big thick brush and Ingres here with a tiny fine little pen point. You know, this is nothing more than the same argument we saw the century earlier. Remember the Rubenists versus the Poussinists? It's the same argument. It's like color versus drawing or paint versus line. It's the same issue. Do you want a rational intellectual style which was seen as linear and therefore more classical, or do you want an emotional, passionate style that uses color and thick mark making to communicate? They're two different points of view, and different generations frame the argument differently, but it's the same argument, and it's a pendulum that just swings back and forth and back and forth, and you have both of these existing simultaneously. We have romantic sculpture. There are a couple of different themes that appear a lot. This is, of course, the Arc de Triomphe, which is Napoleonic. So Napoleon puts this thing out, again, linking himself with Rome. But it's this sculpture here I want to look at. It's one of the most famous. It's known as the Marseillaise, or the Departure of the Volunteers of 1792. And it commemorates the Battle of Valmy. This was the battle when 92 is just before the beginning, the Reign of Terror is about to start. This is when the Austro-Hungarians try and invade France, and the French, you know, push them back. That commemorates this. So it's in the middle of the revolution, and it's you know, pure Baroque. I mean, you know, it goes, you know, I could show you the Laocoon from the Hellenistic period of the ancient Greek world, you know, where he's in that pose. It's exactly the same. All the Baroque paintings where they use the same form, it's all the same. You know, once you figure out how to do drama, you don't change that. You just, you know, you do it pretty much the same way. The face, this is the emotion, the intensity. I love this little figure. I don't know what the heck that's doing there, but nonetheless, it's you know, Rude was one of the most famous of the sculptors, but my favorite of the Romantic sculptors in Paris was Behr, and I chose the one that is in the Nelson Gallery. So you've probably seen this. Check it out next time you go. It's about 40 inches long. It's on display. It's a beautiful sculpture, really popular theme, warfare and sort of animal fights like this. It's nature, it's raw energy. That's what the Romantics loved. Certainly it's exotic. These are not animals you find in Paris. So it's a wild animal in an exotic place. It was a huge market for small bronzes like this. And because they are bronze, there's another whole story about the history of bronzes like this. Typically the artist would make it out of clay, and then it would be cast, multiple times, or sometimes cast after they're even dead. So casting is another whole thing. They used to even have exhibitions of plaster casts made. Once you have the cast, you don't have to cast it in bronze, you can cast it in plaster. So there was even a market for plaster casts, and they had whole exhibitions of just what they called plasters of works like this. So again, this deals with nature, and they're interested in that. It's not about rational control. There's nothing rational here. This is raw energy, completely uncontrolled, totally exotic and foreign, but Bear does all kinds of animals like this. Okay, so let's talk about the romantic landscape, because this is a major theme in romantic art. We've looked at narrative so far. We've looked at romantic narrative, storytelling, in painting anyway. But this is the great age of landscape painting, romantic landscapes. In every country, they're different and develop different types. This is a type of landscape painting known as the sublime landscape. I'll define that in a minute. One of the major exponents of that style is Turner, J.M.W. Turner, very well-known landscape painter in Britain. Turner had a very successful career, and he's unusual in so many ways. One thing that's very unusual about Turner is that he actually came from the working class, and I cannot think of any other artist that came from the working class. Artists tend to all come from the middle class, not from the aristocracy and not from the working class. Aristocrats, I can think of one aristocratic person who became a successful artist, but mostly they don't. It was frowned upon. Plus, aristocrats had duties, responsibilities. They were expected to follow certain lines of employment, or running the manor, whatever. Working class people never. You just didn't have the money to do it. You didn't have access. You didn't have the money. Turner came from the working class, and in fact, people, he had a very strong sort of Cockney accent. It was very clear, where he was from, but it didn't hold him back. And that's because of kind of who he was. He was a very intelligent, very personable person, and a very good artist very, very early. I mean, he was recognized, I think at the age of 11, he was like the youngest person admitted to the school of the Royal Academy in London. I mean, and that made his career. And he was a good businessman too, but you have to be successful. Anyway, a sublime landscape, again, what relationship does it suggest between man and nature? Well, clearly, this is not like the Dutch or the Venetians, where nature is strong, but it's not going to kill you. This is all powerful nature. Man is nothing, dwarfed, and there are a lot of people loved these. They're exciting paintings. The sublime is a term that, at least as these artists understood it, came from the writings of Edmund Burke, who talked about, he wrote a small book, a very influential book back in 1757 called A Philosophical Enquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. And in that, he defined beautiful and sublime. Beauty is not, and never has been, in the eye of the beholder. There's always been a pretty clear definition of what people consider beautiful. It involved symmetry. It involved things that were regular, regularity, calm, not things that were odd or whatever. The sublime is just the opposite. The sublime suggests that human beings are not only attracted to things that are beautiful, but that we're also attracted to things that are frightening and terrifying. And it's very much a vicarious sense of danger that you see here. You know, basically what Burke said is, you know, we don't really want to be in danger. We don't want to be in a dangerous place, but we want the experience of that. And you can get that vicariously through things like paintings or stories or whatever. And that's called the sublime. And that becomes an important voice. You know, today we get that through films and roller coaster rides and all these places where we can get like right up to the edge of danger, but we know it's safe. You know, we know nothing's going to happen to us. Now, in this case, he's chosen Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps from the 3rd century BCE. But this is another historiated landscape, right? The Academy still values narrative. There's still such a thing as history painting in the Academy. And by giving it this antique subject, he's elevating it from just being a landscape to being almost a history painting. The second famous British landscape painter was John Constable, and they couldn't be more different in style. They're friends, they're painting at the same time, but entirely differently, and they're both romantic, they're both escapist. It was obvious how Turner's was escapist. It was not anywhere near our daily experience of life. Maybe less obvious how this is escapist, but it is. John Constable grew up in the English countryside, but not as like a peasant or working in the fields. His father owned several mills, and so he had a good kind of idyllic life in the countryside. But as he grew up later, he lived in London all of his life. This is a nostalgic, romanticized memory of the English countryside. This is not really what the English countryside was like. In fact, there was a lot of turmoil in the English countryside at this time. There was a lot of Luddite insurrections. You know, the Luddites were sort of anti-industrial, and they were attacking a lot of mills and things in the countryside. So it was, you know, a lot of terror and was going on in the English countryside, but you're never going to see that in a Constable painting, because he's remembering it through rose-colored glasses, in a sense, through his youth, and everything is a deal. This is one example where romanticism and idealism do come together. It really is the same thing. Not always the case, but in this case, it kind of is. So he gives us this image very influenced by Dutch landscape. You know, you got the low horizon line here and a lot of sky. We get some water, not completely still, but not rough either. You get the peasants enjoying the weather, the nice attentive dog, the adorable little cottage. All of these things are brought together to suggest a countryside that is peaceful. You know, with industrialism, another thing that came with it was an obsession with the English countryside. This is when you get Wordsworth and all the poems writing about the restorative nature, restorative characteristics of the natural world, and going out into the forest. And there's in England in particular, and paintings like this sort of participate in that dialogue of escape. So this is escapism. The other thing I want to say about Constable and this painting is this is really one of the most believable skies we have seen thus far in painting. And that's because there's scientific study for the first time. The very first books that were published that discussed different kinds of clouds, like cumulus clouds and cirrus clouds and what they are, that was just published. And we know that Constable had read those because in his sketchbooks, he had drawn clouds and labeled them with their new scientific names. And he used to go out doing what he called clouding, which was just going out and painting nothing but clouds. There are dozens of paintings that are just nothing but groups of clouds, different formations and types, and they're all labeled. So he's giving us a sense of the sky that comes from a very different place than we've seen before, from a scientific understanding of what those clouds were and how they functioned. This is the constable that's in the Nelson Gallery. It's somewhat different, but nonetheless, it sort of comes from the same place. It sort of comes from that idyllic sense. You know, when he gives us animals, those look like deer up here. He's giving us a little, or those cows. I can't tell. They look kind of like deer. I guess have to go to the Nelson and figure out what they are. He tends to usually give us domesticated animals. He rarely gives us wild animals. So, but they do look like deer. Anyway, check that out. You can see his paint handling is very, very painterly. You know, he tended to paint in a small area along this river where he grew up, and he paints the same scene sort of over and over and over again. Where Turner traveled the world and painted all sorts of subjects. We've seen that before in art. But the most interesting that I want to get to is the American landscape. And this will finish off our landscape, but there's nothing like American landscape painting. It's unique because it gets all mixed up with the founding of the nation, the development of the nation, the search for an identity, a sort of national identity, all gets rolled into this. Also, the desire to draw people from the East to the West. You know, go West, young man. It gets caught up in manifest destiny, concepts of manifest destiny are all there. Bierstadt, I think, is one of the best. This is from series he did in Yosemite and around Yosemite. And it doesn't fit into any neat category. It's not exactly a natural landscape, it's not exactly a sublime landscape, it's not exactly a classical landscape, but it has characteristics of all of those. It's a sort of combination of all of those. The classical element is easy to see, you know, the framing, the quiet water, the backdrop, but then you get all of this, which suggests infinite spaces and almost something religious. There's no question there's something religious. It's sometimes said that American landscape paintings are America's religious art because there's like, you know, the glowing God. You know, it reminds me of the ceiling of Il Gesù, where you saw that bright light of Jesus in the middle. There's some element of that in here, the vastness of space. Burke actually, when he was writing about the sublime, talked about infinite spaces as being sublime. That in fact, they attract you, but there's a fear there as well, that we're afraid of infinity because we are mortal beings. The concept of infinity is a terrifying one, as is death, which is the next thing you think of. When you think of infinity, you think, well, I'm going to die. And so there's an element of the sublime in infinite spaces and vast spaces. The other important thing to remember is Americans are competing with Europe. Americans don't have the history, they don't have the great cathedrals, they don't have anything that Europe has except for one thing, and that is land and space. And so there's something uniquely American about these wild, untouched spaces. You know, wilderness. You cannot use the word wilderness and Europe in the same sentence because there's no wilderness in Europe. There are forests and things, but the concept of wilderness is uniquely American in the West at this time. And so they're going to use that and tap into that. So we want to show the West as wild, but we want to show it as tameable. We want people to come out, but we don't want to scare them. We want them to feel like you could come to this place and you wouldn't die. And it has that feeling to it. It's attractive, it draws you, its power and energy are clear, but the domestic animals, it's the calm water more than anything that does this. The calm water sort of balances against the wild mountains. You know, they kind of balance each other. And then we get these wonderful animals. Some of his paintings, you see Native Americans, almost like they're the wild animals. They're in their village and it's calm and peaceful. You know, problems, you don't see problems, but then a lot of those problems are happening a little bit later. It's a little early for that in America, but they're presented like almost like the domesticated animals of the Americas. And this is one of my favorite Frederick Churches. Church is a little bit later than, well, not that later than Bierstadt, but this is beautiful painting of Niagara Falls. Actually, if you know Niagara Falls, this is painted from the Canadian side. American landscape painters did not differentiate between political borders. And when we talk about American landscape painting, we do not mean United States. American landscapes run all the way from Canada down through all of South America, and they're still considered American landscapes. So, but you know, this, like the last painting, it captures the wild energy, the power of Niagara Falls. I actually have a photograph, which I can't find, I work a little harder to find it, of Niagara Falls from this exact spot. I know exactly where he was standing. It's a kind of viewing spot to see the falls, and it still looks exactly like this. These rocks are exactly the same. The water's falling exactly the same. So he's captured that beautifully. And notice the format. We don't talk about format a lot. Format is the proportions, right? The ratio of height to width. This is an exaggerated horizontal. And he's doing that, again, to suggest the vast spaces. By exaggerating it, it feels even more so like it goes on and on and on forever. So American landscapes are complicated. They have to communicate a lot of different messages, but they are, you know, directly linked to this search for a self-identity, a way to distinguish yourself from Europe. And these paintings were really popular in Europe. Frederick Church would take over several paintings. This one's not real, most of them weren't too big, and they would set up these panoramas and people would pay to come in. Europeans were obsessed with America, and American landscapes sort of feed into that. You know, it's like, wow, this is what all of America looked like, you know, to a European. This would have, you know, who wouldn't want to see this? You know, who wouldn't want to come and live in a place like this? But, you know, it's totally romantic. It's none of the hardships and the deaths it takes, you know, to get out to this part of the world. You know, people were, it was horrible. But you're not going to see it. It's totally romantic. Oops. So that's all I want to cover today. I managed to get through romanticism. So we're ready to move on to the next topic next time. Did anybody have questions or comments or anything on anything we've covered?
I posted a link to, you made me think about when you commented on a lot of paintings about ships in the sea.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of why in London's gallery, the, what is it, HMS Tempere? I put a link in the chat, why Europe, or excuse me, why Britain voted that to be their favorite painting? To me, it just looks like a boat on water. How does something get to be a nation's favorite?
Oh, there are so many. I mean, I don't know the specific reasons, so I couldn't say. But there are all sorts of paintings, and we'll be looking at some actually, that were immensely famous and important at the time. And we wonder, like, why? I mean, sometimes it has to do with what was happening at the moment they decided it, who that artist is. I'd have to look at the specific situation to see what it is. But, you know, it could be political. It could be many other things.
Well, it's painted in, I'll be curious of your perspective some other time. I sent the wiki link in the comments. It was painted 1838. It was voted favorite in 2005. So I'm curious in art how a painting from ages ago becomes, because again, to me, it just looks like boat on water. I don't know if there's something that you with your art and eyes sees as extra exceptional about this painting.
Well, it's probably nothing to do with the painting. It has to do with what the painting signified to someone at the moment. And I don't know what, you know, that depends on the specific situation. There's nothing in any painting that makes any painting better than any other painting. It's all a personal point of view. So there has to be something going on that at that moment in time when that decision was made affected it. So that would take some research to look into. Which of these links is it?
The Fighting Temeraire. subtitle is Tug to
Oh,
Her
I know
Last
that one.
Breath.
That's a Turner. Fighting
Yes.
Temporary is the Turner. Right, right. That is considered one of his most famous paintings. Because they liked it at the time. There's no other explanation. It is a beautiful painting. It had, I remember it has all the best qualities of romanticism. I mean, you know, we would wonder why many of these paintings were popular. So I don't really have an answer for that. There is no one answer. It was just their favorite
Well, they
painting.
liked it enough that this year they put it on their 20-pound note. So they
Yeah.
put a painting for everybody to look at.
Yeah, Turner has become, in most people's minds, the single foremost British painter, and that's one of his finest works. British love their landscapes or seascapes.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't have any other answer than that.
No worries.
Any other questions? Comments?
Thanks, Peggy.
You're
Thank
very
you.
welcome. You're all welcome. I'll look up and see what I can find on that.
Thank you so
See
much.
if somebody says anything more about it, but I don't think I'm going to find anything.
One question, Peggy.
Yes.
You had mentioned a technique back there, wasn't it? You were talking about the color not being mixed. I think it's
Yeah.
almost like what was the term you used for that? Were the
Divisionism.
divisionism? Yes. Could
Yeah.
you
That term didn't exist at the time that Delacroix was doing it, but it's a term I'll use when we get to Impressionism, and we're not that far away from it. What they called it then, which, you know, they embraced that technique and they looked to Delacroix to do it. What Delacroix was one of the first to be interested in is what we call simultaneous contrast of colors. The meaning really doesn't make much sense relating to those words, but the first real writing on color theory that addressed artists was in about the 1830s, and it was written by a French dye maker who worked in a tapestry company, and he mixed the dyes, the colors, and so he was really an expert on color and color mixing. His name was Eugene Chevreul, and Delacroix not only read his writing, he went to visit this man when he was like 90 years old or something and met him. And Chevreul really initiated this study of color as a theory. And we're going to be talking much more about that because there'll be a lot more complex color theory. What Chevreul is the first to talk about is the idea of how one color affects another color next to it. Like putting two colors side by side changes both of those colors in terms of what they look like. And he may not have understood the scientific reason for that in terms of the eye, the optics of the eye. They will understand that soon. It's because of retinal fatigue. You're looking at a certain color fatigues the color receptors, and so you no longer see that color. It's what happens, you know, everybody's done this, right? You look at a red circle on a white piece of paper and for like a minute, and then look away at a blank white sheet of paper and you'll see a colored dot, but you won't see a red circle, you'll see a green circle. Yeah. You'll see the complement of the color you were looking at. And I will talk more about that specifically, because by the 1880s, they're going to understand that and they're going to use that in ways before. But artists like Delacroix are doing things like that intuitively, just like the Impressionists are doing it intuitively, because they don't quite have the science yet, but they know how to look and see color, and Delacroix's the first to do it. So it begins with divisionism, where you separate two colors you would normally mix and put them side by side and let them interact with one another in interesting ways. So he's considered an important artist for that contribution. And he wrote a lot. All his diaries have been published. Nobody does that anymore. Maybe all these blogs people write are going to be important in the future, because diaries and things were important for us to understand the past. So maybe that will be a new way to understand like what's happening now. But anyway, yeah, we'll do more with color theory.
And that's happens with pointillism, right? That's a very common, if I remember
Exactly.
it correctly, right?
That is exactly it. In fact, they are the first artists to have real books on that kind of color theory. And they're working directly from the books that talk about it. So yeah, they are the ones who, that's the generation that has the first real written color theory. And that's like the 1880s. Anything else? Well then, take care everybody, and I'll see you next week, and we'll talk about the birth of the avant-garde. We'll talk about what that term means, why it comes about, who fits that category, and then we'll talk about the role of socialism in forcing us to look at the real world, whether we want to or not, and that's called realism, when you're forced to look at the real world. So we'll do that next week. So have a good week, everybody.
Thanks,
See you
Peggy.
then.